Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Vitality Project. Our special guest tonight is my dear friend, Angela McLeod.
Hi.
Nice to have you here, Angela. I'm Dr. Bob, for anybody that hasn't come here before. Our topic I'm going to put up in the chat right now is how to distinguish between guilt and shame in our lives. And it's something that, Angela, you and I have talked about a lot over the years of our relationship and conversations in multiple contexts. And I'm glad to have a few minutes tonight to share that with you. We'll talk about it some, maybe, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about it and maybe apply it specifically to how it's relevant to addiction, whether addiction to substance or addiction to other behaviors. And also maybe how it's relevant then to recovery. I know that this is a huge topic and we won't cover all of it tonight. In fact, the next several days of posts will be leading up to an event next Saturday, which is a workshop I'll be leading, whose kind of subtext will be dealing with shame effectively in terms of managing it and ideally reducing it for the sake of recovery. But I think that this can give us a good start, and I can't think about it. I would rather talk with about it than you. So let's dive in, okay?
Okay.
Any thoughts that you have about this distinction? Maybe just to start with that, and we can talk in terms of our own experiences. I certainly hope to myself, and I invite you to as well, Angela.
Okay, great. Yes, this distinction between the two probably became the most clear to me through different conversations we've had, different posts that you've done over the time that I've known you. And it was actually through you that I was introduced to a book about shame, in therapy. I can't remember the title of it. And that was very eye-opening for me in terms of my understanding of shame and how crippling it is. And I really like the simplicity with which you make the distinction between two that often get used interchangeably.
Yeah, all the time.
All the time. And for me, it's been very helpful to identify that distinction in general in my life and my own inner healing, and particularly around addiction recovery. And so just the distinction simply of that being guilty of doing something wrong is more about the action that I did that went against my values or what I believe is right. And the other shame being that I am a bad person, that I'm, unworthy, I'm flawed, I'm awful as a human being. And that those really feel very different. I mean, I can just say those words, but I've put a lot of attention on what is the difference. And one of the things I notice when I'm feeling pretty whole within myself and I do something wrong that goes against my own values, or somebody is hurt by something that I do, when I'm feeling centered in myself and I'm feeling okay in myself, then I usually feel some sadness, some concern, and I feel activated to want to do something to make a repair. And whereas when I'm feeling ashamed of something, whether it's something I did or even didn't do, there's oftentimes I can feel in that crippling shame place. And it's like the opposite. I don't feel motivated to do something. I feel like hiding, or I feel like I collapse. And so those are, to me, the feeling tone of them, they feel very, very different. And so to me, it is really important to bring light to that distinction.
You're very clear about it. It's helpful to have somebody other than in my head talking about it. It's so central to the work that I've done really across my entire career, Angela, as you can well imagine, but particularly in the last 10 years of my focusing exclusively in the realm of addiction recovery. It's just right in the center of virtually every conversation. I had a meeting this afternoon. You and I spoke earlier today. I had a meeting this afternoon with somebody who's in the throes of serious addiction, and was the possible need for hospitalization and a bunch of very serious concerns. And I could feel the family members' pain in terms of trying to make sense of what's going on with this particular family member who's really suffering the ill effects of really severe addiction. And it's hard not to go into blaming as a family member.
Yeah.
In the post today, as I was reflecting on this the last few days and wrote the post, I used the word, it's not a word that I've typically used, but I used the hyphenated word self-blame, because it's as if, there are people that understandably, they can't understand why the individual's acting the way that he or she is. And frankly, for me in my own active addiction, I didn't understand how I was acting the way I was either. And I really like your languaging of it right now. I did things that really violated my deepest values. It's really painful. Even when I say it, I feel the pain of that. There's such grief around that. And it's such a fine line between that kind of grief and then moving into what I did, which was just abject horror with myself. I mean, I just really... I just wanted to crawl into a hole and die. That's really what I wanted to do. I know sometimes when I'm working with individuals in the groups that I lead in treatment centers, in the good old days when we led groups in treatment centers prior to COVID, and I would sometimes say something maybe for shock value, but also because it's true and it's related to what we're saying. I would say, you should feel bad about the things you've done. I'd ask people, how many of you have done something in active addiction that you just feel horrible about? And everyone, if they're honest, will answer that question. And then we begin to fine tune that. How many of you have gone into a sinkhole about feeling like there's no hope for you, that you're basically, as one client said, spawn of Satan, just evil. And to talk about that in a way, and sometimes slightly tongue-in-cheek, but to find some way to talk about this, to really drink our bitter cup of grief, is the way that Carl Jung talked about it, without becoming identified with the evil, the awful things that we've done. So I feel like this whole topic is so critical. It's not a semantic game. Oh, guilt versus shame, what's the big deal? It's like a big deal, it seems like.
Yeah. I agree totally.
Yeah. Other thoughts or reflections? I'm open to any. Go.
I was reflecting on this earlier too, in terms of my own recovery, my own history with addiction and recovery, and I really credit the 12-step program in AA with helping me. It wasn't so much about guilt and shame distinction at that point. This was quite a few years ago. But working with the sponsor, really seriously working through the steps, really helped give me a supportive structure, a way to break things down, to face the things that I had done that were wrong, that had created a huge mess. And with the support of somebody who was very loving, my sponsor, and very intelligent, to help me find the inner strength to kind of move from the shame into the owning the guilt, the wrongness. And then, the 12 steps, the step of making amends was there, which was very scary in a lot of ways, but there was a process that supported me. And so I feel that that it's like before that, I didn't have any models or any much experience, conscious experience with how do I recognize when I've done something wrong and then make a repair. Own up to it, acknowledge it, and see what I can do to fix it. It just isn't the norm in our culture to a large degree, and because there's a lot of potential for being rejected or, losing your work, your family, or whatever, if you say, hey, I did this bad thing. So I'm not sure where I'm going with that, but just that I know that was an important phase for me in terms of, it made me aware of the context and the support around us, and that can help us or hinder us from being aware of our shame, of our guilt, and being able to take action to make the repairs, which then, that gave me more self-esteem and helped reduce some of the shame.
Yes.
Because it can be like this perpetuating cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. Say more about that cycle. I know of what you speak personally, but I'd love to. How does it get into, let's say, a vicious cycle? How does that happen?
Well, it's the if I don't feel support and I don't feel ability to reach out for help, to acknowledge my problems, my wrongs,
Yeah.
then I am likely to continue the addiction, which I
Yeah.
did for years,
Yeah.
and or relapse if I
Yeah.
have,
Yeah.
so a lot of it has to do with it being so stressful,
Mhm. Yeah.
to
Yeah.
be holding the guilt and or shame and
Yeah.
not have any way to process that and make amends or repairs.
Yeah.
So,
You and I have talked about this personally, Angela, over the years, but um, I knew about myself from fairly early on. I think I became conscious of it in my 20s, in young adulthood, is that I had so much vulnerability to shame. I couldn't disclose things that I had grown up with in my family that were painful to me, things that I had done, attitudes I'd had, you name it. And I always felt this way with friends, that they had a better capacity. They could do it better than I could. And I always held a private guilt and shame, even about that. Shame about my shame. And
uh-huh, uh-huh,
I know that when I got into recovery those years ago, and like you, got involved in the 12-step program with a sponsor, I actively contemplated just continuing in my addiction because what was going to be required became very clear.
yeah,
It's like
yeah,
that was my worst nightmare, and I'm quite sure it probably drove me to additional addictive behaviors in the early days, because it was just like, um, for whatever reason, if it was culturally, like you suggested, in our society, maybe specific to my family lineage, I don't know. I just know that, and also my personality. I've got a lot of modesty around private things, and so
yeah,
to announce that to the world, and then to go to a meeting, to go
uh-huh,
to 12-step meetings where not only were you invited to share the
hmm
worst things imaginable, but you're actually mandated. I used to sit in these meetings next to my sponsor. He wasn't going to let me off the hook, and so
uh-huh,
it really was difficult for me.
hmm
And as I've shared with you before in various contexts, I required of myself, I don't think I ever even told my sponsor this, that if I was going to go to a meeting, these were all open, meetings. They weren't speaker-led meetings, the meetings I went to, that I would share at every meeting.
hmm
And I may have driven people crazy, but I did that with purpose. I realized I'm never going to get over this fear. I'm never going to get over my shame about shame unless I really just dive in.
hmm
And I did. I shared every single meeting that I went to, something personal that was painful to me.
hmm hmm
And I have to say, it's a central gratitude for me, not only in working the steps, but being in a context in which sharing your so-called shadow is expected of you and responded to without judgment.
yeah,
Responded to
yeah,
without judgment. It's transformed my life. That
yeah,
that piece alone. And then over the last 10 years, how I've built into my involvement in refuge recovery, which is something related to you and I both have been involved in that and other similar organizations. I've been actively applying forgiveness practice, which is more out of the Buddhist tradition. I've been practicing that every morning, including this morning.
uh-huh, hmm
And between having to disclose in a corporate setting, a meeting like a 12-step meeting, and then doing this inner work of forgiveness practice where I'm constantly clearing out, making amends not only to others, but to parts of myself, I'm not the same person. I'm not the same person. I would not want to go back to being the old person. And I
yeah,
can't believe that that's possible in less than 10 years. Really, that's just 10 years of
yeah,
work that, yeah. And I know that you know this, but I think what I want to say is, whether it's you, Angela, or me, there's a lot of hope if somebody's willing to put themselves to the task of doing this work. And I want to be very first in line to say it was harder than heck for me. It was
hmm
really, really hard for me. And I don't imagine it's been easy for you either.
that's true. It's true. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any further comments? We have a few minutes, and I guess
Okay.
any further thoughts that you have. I'd be
Well,
open to.
yeah, more recently, I've been studying the polyvagal theory and the whole how the nervous system works, and I found it to be helpful to see through that lens, that shame is a part of our biological survival. I mean, what I mean by that is that there is a mechanism within us that's really not even at a conscious choice level, that when we feel threatened, when we perceive some kind of threat, that we can shut down, we can flee, we can fight, we can shut down. And that to see that shame is a part of that mechanism helped me to feel a little bit more understanding of how we're wired, and that it has so much to do, shame has so much to do with relationship, with who we are in relationship with our family, our friends, our tribe, I mean, would we feel shame if it wasn't somehow in relation to how we're perceived by other people? And so I am exploring this now more, and I'm also seeing it sort of the next level for me, like at first, like with the 12-step program and working through amends and cleaning up obvious wrongs, and starting to heal relationships. But now I'm also going into internally to levels of shame that aren't necessarily associated with something I did wrong. And so what I mean by that is that I discover through the Kiloby inquiries and through other kinds of inner work that I have some core beliefs that probably I got in childhood or really very young, that I'm not good enough, I'm unworthy, I'm irreparably damaged. And I think a lot of people can connect with that feeling, I'm not good enough feeling, which to me is another way of speaking of shame. There's a feeling of shame about that. And so that's another level of the work that that I'm working on. I feel like I don't know how long, I mean, it'd probably be ongoing for my life, but I feel compassion about that because it's not something I chose to have happen to me. And I see it in a lot of people. And there's also an interesting aspect of it is that, especially about shame, is that I would not have identified that core belief, I'm not good enough, as being very much about shame or how it feels inside of me. I'm not good enough. And so what I'm trying to say with that is that I think a lot of the shame that I experience is not really at a verbal level. It's a feeling tone. I liked how you put that today in the post. What is it? What is the tone of shame compared to guilt? And so that's where it gets more into trying to track it and notice when it's engaged, when I'm in the shame mode, before I do turn to alcohol or some other behavior, and work on it from a different level. Work on it with compassion, and work on it with people who care about me. So to me, those are like the deeper drivers of underneath addiction.
Thank you. I appreciate you taking a deeper dive. I have so many thoughts. There's such richness in what you're saying. By the way, Angela, I wanted you to know that I posted your name, Stephen Porges's name, Polyvagal Theory, as well as Kiloby Inquiries, just as resources for people to follow up online.
Wonderful.
Because I know of your expertise and commitment to this with Stephen Porges's work, and also your advanced training with Scott Kiloby and the convergence of all of that. I do believe this is that we talk in psychology about predisposing factors to depression or to anxiety. And I think a predisposing factor that is common, there are exceptions to this. I don't think there's anything that's universal, absolutely. But they represent an exception to a rule, is that I work with very few clients who are in recovery from severe addiction, whether it's addiction to alcohol or other drugs, or addiction to self-defeating or self-destructive behaviors, or even self-destructive attitudes such as prejudice or hatred or violence. I work with very few clients that when you get down deep enough that it's anything other than what you're talking about. And it's a tricky thing. If you and I were to do a little poll, I know that you're up in Washington and I'm down here in California. If I was to go out right now and just ask people on the street, how are you with shame? Do you experience shame? Most people aren't conscious of it. Most people, most clients coming to see me, they'll say, I've got a lot of issues, but shame isn't one of them. It goes completely in a subterranean way, and it's almost the lens through which we see reality. And so how can you comment on the glasses if you are the glasses? And so I really appreciate what you're saying. You and I have talked about this before. One of the psychoanalysts that I appreciate, he talks about the unthought known.
Yeah.
That you can know something, but just like you just said, you can't think it. You sure as heck can't put it into words, but you can feel it in your body. It's a felt sense in your body. And I think that was part of the wish with this morning's exercise in our post is can you think of a time where you felt really, really ashamed for whatever reason? Because my guess is there's oftentimes a triggering event, but as is applied by what you're saying, what it's triggering is this deep subterranean kind of foundation of shame that's typically developmental. I mean, we pick it up early on, and it's next to impossible to talk about, and it really affects our behaviors, not the least of which I think is directly related to addiction. I can't even think of the two without connecting them anymore. Is that shame? And here's the irony, and here's the it's a very painful thing for me, but it's also an opportunity for compassion, is that if shame, in fact, is one of these nearly universal predisposing factors for addiction, and then I begin to fall into addiction, into enslavement, let's say to a drug, and then society at large, as well as anybody that cares about me, as well as I, judge and vilify me, condemn me, then how sad to me that the thing I'm doing to try to self-medicate or otherwise manage my shame now becomes the source of increased shame. That people can talk about. When I talk with clients who are in recovery, they can talk about the shame oftentimes, most often, that follows. Very, very rarely does somebody say, oh, I've never been ashamed for my addiction. I mean, everybody can relate to that. The trickier part is to take the time to dive down deeply to realize that what that proximal current shame is evoking is distal or distant shame that you've lived with your whole life. And I think that for somebody to really find a sustained basis for long-term recovery from whatever addiction we might imagine, I think it requires getting down to this deep of a level. And I think you probably agree with that.
I do. Yeah, I do.
Yeah. There's no quick
and
fixes.
It's possible. Yeah,
it is possible.
It's valuable work, and I also feel that as awful as it can feel to do this work, this harder, deeper work, it is worth it. And there's more people who are supportive, like you, and finding those people that are supportive. I wanted to sort of end on a positive note because it sounded like
you just evoked something for me. Give me just a second. It's a poem I was memorizing this morning when I was swimming, and it's fresh for me. Let me see if it comes back.
Okay, good. Yeah, I love
a few hours ago. Just going to give myself a second.
Sure.
It's something like this. It's pretty close to it. Okay. It's from Lao Tzu. It's from Lao Tzu. So this was written 500 BC from China. The first line is a bit vague to me, but once I get into it, it'll come. And I want to unpack it just in the spirit of really finishing on a more positive note, just like what you just said. He says, how is it that hope is as hollow as fear? So you wouldn't think of that. How is it that hope is as hollow as fear? And he said, hope and fear both arise from thinking of the self. And what I want to do is I want to apply to what we're talking about. There are ways that we relate to ourselves where we're in this place of, I just want to hope and I don't want to get near fear. And he says, they both those feelings arise when we think of the self. He says, when you don't see the self as self, that is, if you're not caught up in self-consciousness, like what shame, I mean, if you think about it, shame is like the ultimate self-consciousness.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
If you don't see the self as self, what is there to fear? Which reminds me of another poem that is a favorite that we've shared before. This one's by Rumi from the 13th century. He says, I love this poem. He says, How to cure bad water?
Uh,
You like this one too?
yeah.
How to cure bad water? Send it back to the river. There's a secret medicine given only to those who hurt so hard they give up hope. That's you and me, Angela.
Yeah. Yeah.
He finishes by saying the hopers would feel slighted if they knew. So
Yeah.
what we're talking about is that the work that's required requires us going deeper than just hoping for some kind of quick remedy,
Yeah.
and also provides a resolution to fear. The fact is the secret medicine requires us going back to the river and being washed clean, diving into it. And that's the work of therapy. That's the work of recovery and so on. But it's the only game in town, and it's effective. And I love that last line. The hopers would feel slighted if they knew. I spent most of my life being a hoper, Angela. I did. I spent most of my life just hoping that this pain inside of me, the depression, the anxiety, would it just please go away, dear God?
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't. It didn't. And finally, in the parlance of the 12-step program, I hit bottom, you hit bottom. It took me a few hitting bottoms to finally begin to go to work.
Yeah.
And that's made all the difference. You and I are ambassadors of hope, because both you and I have been through the dark night of the soul with our addictions respectively, and we've done the dark night of the soul work that we've done, and there is hope. There is secret medicine, everybody out there.
Yeah.
I tell you what, I'm going to wind up in just a
Okay.
second. What I want to say is I'm going to put up that banner for next week's workshop. We'll be spending 2 hours next Saturday morning, not tomorrow, but next Saturday morning, the 25th, from 9 to 11 Pacific time. And so much of what we'll be talking about that day, Angela, I really hope you can come. I hope you can join.
I think I will be able to.
Yeah, I hope that you can.
Okay.
It's going to be interactive. We'll be using Zoom technology. We'll all have a chance to interact. There may be 10 people, there may be 20 people, I don't know, but there'll be a number of people. And what we'll get a chance to do is, speaking of deep dives, really go deeply into this whole topic. And our conversation today is a really wonderful, I think, a prelude to that. I'd really encourage anybody that resonates with what Angela said today or what we've shared today to consider coming to this workshop. It's next Saturday morning. If you can rustle up $10, that'll help pay for the advertising, basically.
Yeah.
I'd love to have you join. And the link is here in the banner below. We'll be looking at the title of the workshop is from my partner in the Vitality Project, Jason Reno. Don't take addiction personally. And the subtitle, I think, relates directly to what we're talking about: how not to hate the addict in your life, even if it's you, because that's really another way to talk about shame. How do we not hate ourselves in terms of the mistakes we've made? And I think that there is secret medicine for that. And we'll be talking into that. This will be the first workshop, and it's going to be, it'll be a 2-part workshop. I'm actually working on the second part already, a second workshop, hopefully, God willing, in August, where those 2 workshops together will really attempt to give us a leg up in terms of some really practical ways of understanding how shame takes root in addiction, why it's problematic. We'll go into more detail. We'll even be talking about how it affects our brains and so on.
Oh, good.
And I'd love to have you there to talk about the polyvagal there. I mean, it'd be wonderful to have us use a resource. It's always wonderful to have you here.
Yeah. It's great to be with you here, Bob.
Yeah. Thank you. I wish you a blessed weekend, my dear. I hope you have a good weekend. All that have joined us, I wish you the same. Thank you. I wish safety for all and well-being for all. Come back and join us next Saturday. I'm going to have a brief Facebook Live event tomorrow to remind people that weren't here tonight of next week's event. But and also, please come back next Friday, because Angela and I will be here every Friday night at this time, exploring, going where we go, which is such a pleasure.
Great.
All right. Be well. Take good care, Angela. Have a good evening.
You too.
Nice to see you.
Bye.
Okay. Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.